What's the good news here for Bitcoin? Break that down for me, because I think there's some people losing hope long term, and I don't want them to miss the big picture. What did you guys find?
Thanks for first of all having me on to walk through this. And the idea behind this report was, not to convince people of, Bitcoin's value proposition. This piece is really put in context of you already understanding the value proposition of Bitcoin and just focuses on Bitcoin as a monetary network and the network effect that that monetary network has.
The first thing you looked at is this S curve, right? Everyone's heard of this. It's how you decide if you're early to something or if you're late. The internet went through it. Mobile phones went through it. Bitcoin obviously now going through it. And if you look at the Bitcoin price, you say we're at $30,000 or we're at 20,000 bucks. I think everyone over the past couple of years has said, yeah, I'm way too late on Bitcoin. I'm not going to make any money in this. Maybe that's the reason they went too hard in the altcoins. I know I've been guilty of that at times. But you guys look at this S curve. Where do you think Bitcoin is?
To start, just to talk about an S curve, you separate into several different sections. So you have innovators, early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. You have the, people who get in relatively early. These are people who, are very forward thinking, super innovative, and they're taking tremendous risk, both mostly financially as well as career risk and mental capital as well. And those kind of early innovators and early adopters kind of help get the asset class off the ground. And then after we kind of exit those early phases, then we move on to kind of the early majority, where you had people that were maybe a bit skeptical at first, had some of their early skepticism proven wrong, or maybe they just come alive to some of the talking points that the early adopters have been pushing and just they hadn't come to fruition for them, or whatever it may be that had gotten them on board. But they're perhaps still forward looking, but not as prone to risk taking or as convicted in the idea as the innovators or early adopters. That pushes us into that late majority phase. And then the laggards, where you kind of have everyday people that start to implement the technology. Kind of the risk around using the technology has been taken off. It's no longer kind of in the early days, and you're reaching kind of that consensus use of the technology. With that in mind, I think when you look at this S curve, the kind of inflection point from that slow to suddenly is right around 10%. And that's kind of a rough estimate that we're using. Around that 10% is where you start to see that main point of the asymptote of the S curve. But I do think we're still in that exiting that kind of early adopters.
So we're not laggards yet.
Not yet.
I think most people would assume that. Like if you ask the average person, are you too late to Bitcoin? I think even since 2018, people would say that.
I think a lot of people just look at the price being 21,000 or up at 60,000 last year. People say, oh wow, that's a large number, I must be late, and kind of getting that unit bias versus actually looking at kind of the underlying user data, as well as just understanding even $1 trillion asset class is really small in kind of the grand scheme of the financial system. But from an adoption standpoint, adoption and price correlating, but not necessarily, you can't really attach a value of saying one user adds X amount of value. Because, for example, someone who's using Bitcoin to be banked in an area that they couldn't otherwise, access the banking system in somewhere like Nigeria or El Salvador, they're a user, but perhaps, they're not adding as much capital into the network as, if the Saudi prince threw in a couple $1 billion. So therefore, I think it's difficult to attach a dollar value per user. But I do think over a broad scope of looking at this and zooming out, there is definitely a correlation between the number of new users coming in and the price.
Quick shout out, if there are any Saudi princes listening and you want to throw in a couple billion, it's a great time. I think I was top 10 in the Emirates for the podcast downloads on iTunes. So if you're listening, there's got to be one of you guys out there chucking a bill or two. It looks like a good time to buy. We could use the help. So Will, how do you actually measure this thing, knowing that different people have a different impact, but at the same time, Metcalfe's law says a network's value should proportionally grow with the amount of users? I think that makes sense to most people. More people adopting Bitcoin means Bitcoin has a better chance of winning, means Bitcoin long term, we're still very small if you look at where Bitcoin is going to be if it wins in 20 years. So how do you actually measure where we are?
We look at all these technologies: the automobile, landline, tablet, cellular phones, radio, smartphones, the internet, social media. We kind of plot them out, and on the bottom end of the scale is the years since initial adoption. And what you see is that some of these technologies that were spread on quote unquote analog rails before the internet reach that kind of point of saturation and plateau out in the growth of their adoption much later on than the technologies that are spread on the internet. And I think that's a very important point to understand, in addition to like the direct monetary incentive to adopt Bitcoin, but the fact that it's spread on the rails of the internet, on social media. And therefore, you can think of it as spreading on essentially a super highway versus, a dirt path. I think that's just one important thing to understand of why we see that Bitcoin will be, if we, look at the spectrum of all these technology adoption curves, on the further end towards these internet native ones. So to use this, we look at on-chain data, which is something that I'm fairly knowledgeable in. Also, we feel like this was the best way to have a hard quantifiably way to identify the user growth versus kind of guesstimating user data on exchanges or whatever. With that in mind, though, it is important to understand that like some of these figures likely do underestimate the actual number of quote unquote people who are using Bitcoin by owning it, because a lot of people do hold their Bitcoin on exchanges or custodians. First thing that we're looking at is something called new entities. The number of new individual unique clustered addresses are coming on the network every day. The problem with this metric, for the sake of our report, though, is that it doesn't take into account the entities that are leaving. That kind of leads us to the next chart, which is something called net entities growth. And so net entities growth is looking at the number of new users that we just looked at, so the number of new entities minus the number of entities that are leaving the network, and that's where we get the net growth. And so as you'll see, this looks a bit different from the previous chart. This, in our opinion, is the best way from an on-chain perspective to identify how many users are on the network right now. But when we take the cumulative sum of this, it's up and to the right. Of course, again, accelerating more so in times of price appreciation. But that number right now sits at about 30.8 million unique entities on the network right now. So what does that mean? It means that there's been 253 million unique users on the base chain that have ever been on the network versus 30.8 million, which are on the network right now. So the active users. And so when you measure that against the global population, we're looking at right now about 0.36%, about 1/3% of the global population that are unique individual users on the Bitcoin base chain right now.
That's pretty damn small.
Yeah.
Smaller than I would have guessed. How many people are on Earth? 6 billion?
I think it's 7.9 billion.
7.9 billion. If there's 300 million in the US. So even if all those people lived in the US, I know that's not the case, but hypothetically, we're like 10% penetration in the US if everyone was based in the US. And that's tiny.
I mean, to be fair, again, this likely underestimates a bit, but I do like that I'd rather be on the conservative side than overestimating and have like hard data to back it up. But like there have been, some estimates done by like other data sources that say maybe the adoption is closer to like 3 or 4%. But, from an on-chain perspective, we're looking at, again, about 1/3%. But even if you're, implementing, exchange users, things like that, you're still, very, very small. And still, either way, before that kind of main asymptote of where historically the adoption curves accelerate.
If you were to look at an S curve, we're not even off the ground. Like we're on the bottom left part of the S. I mean, it's one of those weird questions where you can ask someone, and if you just had them guess, as I was saying, I think most people would say, I don't know, 10, 20% of the world has adopted already, which would put us kind of halfway up through this S. That just isn't the case when you guys look at the hard data of how many people are actually owning, moving Bitcoin. Sure, add in the people on exchanges, but we're less than 1%. Does that really bump it up past 10? I don't think so. I mean, that's just crazy, dude.
When I posted this chart, it looked so ridiculous that like you had people on Twitter that like didn't read the report, I guess, and just saw like I had done like a Twitter thread when we first sent it out. And we're like, this looks ridiculous. Like you just made this up. And I think a lot of people thought that I just like extrapolated the rate of growth out, into the future blindly, or just took a crayon and just drew an S curve, like projecting it out into what I thought in my head it would look like in the future. Again, this is based on the historical adoption curve. So like what we did is we took the rate of increase of the weighted mean of all those historical adoption curves, and then we can apply where we are in terms of global adoption for Bitcoin. Again, when you measure up the Bitcoin centric user growth as a portion of the global population relative to those historical technological adoption curves, that's where we get this visual from. According to our projections, we haven't even hit that main kind of phase of the asymptote. We're still kind of transitioning soon from that like slowly to suddenly point in the adoption curve.
Well, this is amazing because I have only seen bad news all week. This is the first piece of good news that I'm seeing with Bitcoin that actually has me pretty damn excited.
The coolest visual, I would say, of the whole report for me, and we plot out the projection that we have of the user adoption relative to Bitcoin supply issuance. And I think this is like the cleanest bullish case for Bitcoin in one visual, where you have, Bitcoin's monetary policy becoming increasingly deflationary while you have parabolic increase of new users coming on over the next few decades. And that to me is really kind of the ultimate, kind of bullish case for BTC. Over a long-term view, it's kind of only got one direction to head.
Remember to drop a like if you enjoyed this clip from Stacks, the best show for crypto investors. You can always catch the full episode by clicking on the link right down below in the description. And be sure that you subscribe so you can hear how other investors and traders and hedge funds and VCs are making money in the crypto market. I'll see you on the next one.